The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
It will be available for everyone to play, use within their congregations after this webinar is over. You've already heard Annie, but I'd just like to let you know who she is. Our speaker for today is Annie Feder-Cruz, Anita Annie Feder-Cruz from ecoAmerica's Blessed Tomorrow program. She's the director for that program. We see this guide as a tool to help to continue to move forward in addressing the climate change emergency that we're facing today. Even though we're facing an emergency, we do emphasize that we move forward with hope. But we must maintain and sustain a climate awareness action starting from today to 2020 and beyond. And now I'd like to turn it back over to Annie, and she will give you some background about ecoAmerica and the Blessed Tomorrow program.
Great, thank you, Ruth. And just to outline today's agenda, so we are going to be doing obviously what we're doing right now, which is introducing ourselves and discussing the goals of the webinar. But then we'll do an overview of the guide itself, which again is available on elca.org/environment or the blessedtomorrow.org website. And we'll talk through what the call to care for creation is, our call as people of faith. We'll talk a little bit about what you need to know, what you need to do to address climate change, what you can do, and then some next steps so that you can take this information back to your congregations, to your communities, to your families, and hopefully take action. So I just want to talk a little bit about ecoAmerica, the umbrella organization that houses Blessed Tomorrow. So ecoAmerica is a nonprofit that's working in some key sectors in the United States to help build public support for climate solutions. We are helping these sectors to demonstrate visible leadership on climate change by making climate change a priority in the work that they do. We're helping to empower climate literacy and people's understanding of what climate change is and how it impacts the issues that they care most deeply about. And certainly to engage constituents within those sectors, and then hopefully to build collective action and advocacy so that we can really see the changes that we need to see in order to address this emergency, as Ruth called it earlier. We are working in 3 key sectors. So the Blessed Tomorrow program is working with the faith community. We have our Climate for Health program, which works with health professionals. The Climate for Health program has partnerships with organizations like the American Public Health Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Association of Environmental Nurses, and several other organizations that are, again, working on this issue to try to advance climate solutions nationally. And then we have our Path to Positive Communities program, which is working with local governments, city council members, mayors, sustainability directors within local communities to help them lead on climate change as well. And then through those 3 sectors, again, we're hoping to build collective action and advocacy. But what I want to tell you a little bit more about, because we are all people of faith, and I will tell you I am a Lutheran, an ELCA Cradle Lutheran, born and bred, went to a Lutheran university, and still currently engaged with my own home congregation here. But that hat off, Blessed Tomorrow is working with a variety of different national faith institutions, again, to help lead on climate change as part of our call to care for creation. So, especially in the Christian tradition, understand that we're called by God in Genesis 1 to act in support of God's creation, to keep and till it, as it says. And we're really working to help the ELCA, other denominations that I'll mention in a moment, to become climate literate, to help clergy and members act on caring for God's creation by doing things like moving towards 100% clean energy, and then certainly advocating with their local communities, whether it's something like in congregations or even with policymakers, if that's something folks are comfortable doing. And we'll be talking a lot more about how you can do that if that's something that you personally feel called to do. So the guide, we actually worked directly with several of our partners to develop this tool that you all are hopefully have in front of you and we'll be reviewing together. This includes the ELCA, but also other organizations like the Episcopal Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, historically Black church organizations like the AME Zion and AME churches, the Methodist Church, the Islamic Society of North America, and an umbrella organization called Creation Justice Ministries that all of the large Protestant organizations belong to, including ELCA. So we have a lot of rich support from the faith community on this guide, and we certainly hope that it's of great value to you. So specifically, what is the purpose of the guide? So again, it's a congregational tool. It's meant to help you do all of these core things, understand what the moral imperative is to care for creation, and specifically to address climate change as a matter of faith. We talk about how congregations can move toward 100% clean energy, and this includes things as simple as efficiency work that maybe you've already engaged as a congregation or as individuals, all the way up to things like advocacy. So we will talk through all of these key areas together today, and we'll dive in a little bit more deeply in just a moment. But first, I want to pass this actually back to Ruth. We had a chance to work with the ELCA on a great project, and she's going to introduce it for you, and then we'll give you a little showing. Ruth, I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Annie. Yes, before we get started with more details about the guide, we'd like to show you the video that we produced in a collaborative effort with ecoAmerica's Blessed Tomorrow program. The video is entitled God's Work, Our Hand, and it does reside on ELCA's website. We hope that you will find the video useful and informative and use it within your work within the congregations and in communities. Before we get started with the video, I do want to let everyone know that please feel free to do it anytime during the presentation to put any questions you may have in the chat. That will be the way in which you will be able to ask questions, and then Annie will be able to see your questions to be able to start it. Go ahead and start the video, please.
Great.
As members of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we are called to be God's hands in the world. Whether it's caring for our neighbors, protecting our children, or seeking justice for the most vulnerable among us, it's our duty to go out in the world and change it for the better. We live these values every day. Our Lutheran Disaster Response and ELCA World Hunger Program serve communities near and far. We are a church that rolls up our sleeves and gets to work.
Spent many summers working at a Christian church camp in North Carolina. And on the first week of camp, we brought in more than 100 youth from an urban setting. And during that week, we took them out to the mountains. And as we approached the first waterfall, I heard a youth gasp. And I said, "What's wrong?" She said, "I've never seen a waterfall." If we want to sustain those experiences and maintain those natural settings, we need to have a conversation about how we can care for them. And God calls us to be a part of that story, to work for change, to care for all that God has created.
By not being good stewards of what we have, then the impact or the consequences of those natural disasters can be bad. We need to always be aware that those things are going to happen, and we should always have that spirit of cooperation to help our sisters and brothers.
Studies have shown that congregations where pastors talk about climate change have people who are more likely to engage in taking care of creation and to advocate for climate solutions. I think it is our duty to love the world that God gave us, because in faith we practice loving each other, but also loving the world as well.
God gave us a beautiful world, and it's my responsibility to care for it, protect it, and leave it better than we found it.
Congregations are already doing a lot. They're putting solar panels on their roofs. They're looking for ways to reduce their carbon footprint and use less energy. They're planting community gardens. They're cleaning up waterways. But you know what? We can do more.
The ELCA is partnering with ecoAmerica's Blessed Tomorrow program, a faith community and initiative that empowers climate action and advocacy. The partnership helps us strengthen our climate leadership, infusing it into all of our aspects of our church.
You can take action today. Get involved with ELCA's creation care programs. Talk about climate change with your families, friends, colleagues, and local congregations, and inspire others to do what they can to protect our climate and this world that we call home. Together, we can truly be God's hands in the world. Please join us.
Okay, now we'll turn it back over to Annie to go through the presentation on the guide. And remember that you can input any questions that you have in the chat section. Annie?
Great, thanks Ruth, and I hope you all enjoyed that video. Again, as Ruth mentioned, this was developed really for all of you to use. So it's available on the elca.org/environment page. And we do hope that you'll use it to share with others, to potentially show to your congregations as a way to demonstrate that this really is a priority for us as we live out our faith. So now that we've heard that call to care for creation directly from the video, I want to dive into the specifics that we walk through in the guide. So here we're going to get into what we need to know. What do we need to know as we start to undertake this work? So specifically what we need to know are some key points, and this is how we've structured the guide itself. So we highlight 8 key areas, and we're specifically sharing what we think are important truths and specific data about getting, and without getting too much into jargon, and we're trying to avoid too much doom and gloom. This can be a pretty heavy topic to talk about, and we know from our own research and really just from social science that when you present an issue that feels quite as large as this, that it can be overwhelming, and it's really important to help you all understand that yes, climate change is a moral issue, but you can lead, and there are ways that we can make a difference. We're certainly not alone. So many faith traditions are leading on this issue right now, with not just the ELCA, but we have the United Church of Christ, who's made care of creation one of the top 3 issues for their denomination. The Episcopal Church has done the same. And so there are others within the faith community leading on this, and we're certainly not alone. And we specifically go into how climate solutions help everyone. There's definitely a transition that we're going to have to make as a country and as a world, and we know that that transition must be just. There are communities and individuals, families that we may know ourselves or be ourselves who rely on the fossil fuel industry. And as we think about moving to a clean energy economy, that we're really thinking about how to ensure that communities who rely on those industries now are held as harmless as possible and are provided opportunities to take advantage of kind of the new place that we're all moving towards. We know that solutions sometimes require investment, and we'll talk a little bit about how individual homes or congregations can plan for that. And then I think most specifically, and what I'm going to go into next, is that climate change really affects the most vulnerable among us. And as we think about our call to care for our neighbor, this is really specifically something to keep in our hearts. So this is a helpful graphic. I know many of you on the call today may be familiar with what is climate change and what's happening in the world today. But just to create a baseline for everyone on the call, so what we know is that the carbon emissions that have been happening throughout the last 100+ years since the Industrial Revolution have continued to accumulate in the atmosphere. And you can see that here on the left-hand column. And correspondingly, we know that as the carbon pollution in the atmosphere increases, as the concentration increases, we see an increase in global temperature. This is actually global land and ocean temperature. And we know that it's not just carbon emissions. There are other greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change, like methane. But I just thought this was a helpful visual for everyone. And then not even that, so that was just starting at the industrial age. But when we look back even farther, this is actually from ice core data, going back to about 800,000 years. We know that, yes, climate change happens on a regular basis. So this is part of the natural cycle for us to get to hotter and colder periods of time. The lower peaks here on the trend going back many years indicate some closer to ice ages within the historical record. But if you look all the way to the right-hand side here, what we see right now is that CO2 levels in the atmosphere are far above what they've been in the last 800,000 years. And in fact, just in the mid-century of this century, we expect them to be, you could see, 3, 4, 5 times what they've ever been in the historical ice record. So this is why this is such an important issue. And I think, at least for me, it's really helpful to see these visual images as we start to talk about what this actually means for us as the human community. So I think, again, something that's helpful when I talk about this with people of faith is to really talk about how climate change impacts the things that we already prioritize in our work as people of faith. So these are just some examples of existing ministries that most of our partners already care about, things that they're investing time and energy into, and money. And I want to just quickly go through what this looks like. So when we think about things like global ministry, we know that there are droughts that lead to dehydration and smaller crop yields. We know that with climate change, and we see increased waterborne disease. And we also see increased flooding as a result of extreme weather events, something we're seeing literally as we speak. And there was an article or a report on NPR this morning about the flooding impacts to farmers in the Midwest. What about hunger? This is a ministry that many congregations are active in right now. We know that climate change leads to an overall decline in both food quantity and quality, and that this can even impact the nutritional value of food. And so as we think about the important work that we're doing to reduce hunger in our country and in our world, climate change is going to make that work much more difficult. What about migration? This is certainly a hot topic of the day. And we currently know that some of the effects of climate change are actually contributing to existing migration concerns. When we think about the Syrian conflict or some of the Central and South American migration patterns, some of that's being caused by things like floods and droughts. People are no longer able to make a living doing the things that they had made before. And just as we go into things like peace, conflict, and climate change, when those people leave their homes to find a better opportunity somewhere else, there are often times where groups of people who may not have lived together come together. That can create conflict, it can create strain, and it can exacerbate existing tensions that exist. Again, we've seen this in the Syrian conflict, for example. What about poverty? This is something we all care about for sure. And again, we can see that things like income inequality continues to be exacerbated by climate change. We know that unemployment increases. What about race? Racial reconciliation is something that a lot of denominations are talking about right now. But we know that climate change impacts communities of color at a much greater rate than it does other communities. This statistic here about ozone smog is a great example, where we see natural gas emissions in African American communities are causing over 138,000 asthma attacks among school children. So this is a dramatic statistic to think about. What about women and gender health or gender equality? We know that there are already communities who are more at risk for things like homelessness, and their ability to continue to struggle with those issues will just be exacerbated as we see things like rising hurricanes, homes being destroyed, communities being unable to recover. And things like intergenerational justice. So I'm sure you have all been hearing about the youth who are marching on climate change, both in the US and around the world. But we know that the young people of my own children are going to be the ones most impacted by climate change. Myself and certainly the generation before me may not even feel the worst effects of climate change. It's really going to be our children and their children who are experiencing those most substantial impacts as we, again, if you remember back to the graph of the carbon emissions, as those carbon emissions continue to escalate. And then finally, just thinking about the impacts to our health. This is what we're seeing a lot of already right now. And we know that asthma rates can be increasing in communities that are experiencing the effects of climate change. We know that we see increased issues with mental health. When you think about the communities in Puerto Rico who were affected by the hurricanes last year, sadly there was an increase in suicide rates among those communities because it's just a really devastating thing to experience. The wildfire communities, devastated hurricane communities, etc. Okay, so I just told you, sometimes when we talk about this, it can feel really heavy. And I just shared a lot of heavy stuff with you all. I like to think about Psalm 119, verse 105. Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And so we know that God doesn't show us the future. He's not a floodlight or the sun showing us everything in front of us. It's really just what's right in front of us. And we have to, in faith, move forward with what we're given. And we are certainly called to such a time as this. And so I want to talk about what we can do, because there are absolutely things that we can do today. Of course, we can be thankful. We can be thankful for the goodness of God in creation. It was very good. It is very good. And we should be grateful for the gifts that we have been given. And we should be praying for guidance. And I think that the power of prayer can be really incredible as we feel the weight of this issue. And then finding support and talking with your community and your congregation. If you haven't already, think about assembling a creation care team of lay people. Think about including facility management staff, your clergy, or other community leaders. And of course, we encourage you to use this guide to plan, and we'll dive into the details here in just a minute. We encourage you to get started on simple things, and then think about rolling the savings forward as you experience savings through things like installing LED light bulbs. There are ways to invest that into longer term activities. And then we'll talk a little bit about ways that you can describe the work that you're doing in a public way that encourages others to join you. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the specifics of mitigation, which is the technical term that a lot of environmental folks throw around, but this is really, we're talking about good stewardship of our energy resources. So specifically, what are some things that you can do? I'm actually going to skip forward to the next slide here because I think this visual is really helpful. So we produced this path, this roadmap, to move towards 100% clean by 2030. That is quite an ambitious goal. We know not everyone's going to be able to get there, but this is just a way to think about how you might get there. Not all of these steps have to be taken in order. You can do some of these things before or after the other, but we know that it's helpful to provide a path. So what do you do first? Well, you create a baseline of your energy use as is. You can do this as an individual and a family. You can do this as a congregation. You want to start tracking your electric bills, your gas and heating bills, and think about how to set reduction targets and timelines. Once you've created that baseline, you can start thinking about how you might conserve energy use. Things I'm sure many of you are familiar with and probably are already doing, moving to LED light bulbs, things like installing smart thermostats, weather stripping. And then when we think about transportation, are there ways that you might be able to do things like carpooling to church every Sunday, or identifying other ways to get there, whether it's biking or public transportation. Once you've gotten some conservation under your belt, you're probably going to start to see some savings. And there's a way that you can start to invest those savings into more substantial improvements. So over a year or two or three, you may save enough money to start investing in things like a new HVAC system, or insulating walls and ceilings, attics, etc. Perhaps moving towards something like a tankless water heater. And with those changes, again, you start to see more savings. We want everyone to be thinking about ways that they can move towards using clean energy sources. So many congregations have thought about installing solar panels. I was just with the African Methodist Episcopal Church on Monday, and a congregation stood up and talked about how not only have they eliminated their electric bill using solar that they installed, but they actually get a fee back from the grid as they're generating more than they use. And so it's actually a source of income for the congregation. So these are things that you can think about now if you're ready, or down the road as you start to, along this path. And then, of course, there's always going to be carbon emissions that we just can't reduce. We have to take that plane ride. We need to drive to work every day, or there may be some other use that we're not able to reduce. And here's where we can be thinking about offsetting our carbon emissions. There is potentially a cost associated with this, but we have produced, and I'll talk a little bit more about, a tool that will help you as an individual or a congregation to do this kind of work, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. We also provided a worksheet. This is a very basic worksheet. It is not going to be exactly what you need to go into great detail about your energy efficiency and cost savings, but it's a way to, again, create that baseline and to start thinking about, if I took this step or that step, what might it save me over time, and what might that allow me to invest in over time. And finally, in this section, we provide some great resources for you to learn more. So the guide is meant to be kind of an introduction to this work. There are lots of organizations and tools out there that can help you to really dive in deeper. The ELCA is really lucky to have a partner in Lutherans Restoring Creation, which is supporting congregations in the ELCA to do all kinds of creation care activities, including mitigation activities. There's a great tool with the EPA Energy Star program that's called Portfolio Manager. And it actually allows you to do a pretty sophisticated analysis of your energy use and benchmark your use against other congregations. And I really encourage for folks who really want to dive into this to consider using this tool. We also partner with an organization called Interfaith Power and Light. They have 40 chapters in states around the country, and they're local grassroots organizations that are working with congregations to do things like greening their churches. They have a program called the Cool Congregations Program that provides a lot of wonderful support, and they're pretty familiar at the local level about different options that might be available to you locally. You also have a great resource with Creation Justice Ministries, which again is that national umbrella organization that coordinates across all of the large Protestant denominations, actually most Christian denominations. And they provide liturgical resources, they provide toolkits, Sunday school programming materials, and they actually do advocacy at the federal level on behalf of all of the denominations that they work with. You have Green Faith, which is a great organization that has an individual tool called Living the Change that can help you assess things that you can do as an individual to reduce your own carbon footprint. And then, as I mentioned, we at Blessed Tomorrow have our own carbon offset program. It's called Blessed Tomorrow Cool Effect Carbon Offsets. And it allows you to, again, for those carbon emissions that you're just not able to eliminate or reduce, that you can actually purchase credits that help others to reduce their carbon emissions. And we've selected a program that purchases clean cook stoves for families in Uganda. So again, you enter some data, it tells you how much carbon emissions you still have, and then it puts a price on that, and you can offset that those carbon emissions by helping others to cook clean and healthy in their families. We've done an estimate, and most congregations would be able to do this for $100, maybe $200 a year. So it's not insignificant, but it's not substantial of a cost. All right, so second, so we talk about mitigation, but we also talk about adaptation. So again, another technical term here, but how we think about it is how can we as faith communities, as individuals, congregations, and actual places of worship, think about creating refuge in the face of climate change. We know climate change is happening now, as we've discussed already, but we know it's going to get worse. And there are ways that we can be preparing ourselves, our buildings, for climate impacts that allow us to provide refuge to our community as we continue to move forward. We know that there are different regional impacts of climate change, and the guide talks specifically about what you might expect depending on where you live in the country. And then we talk through 7 key steps to take. So again, you can assemble a team to work on planning. This may be your disaster response team. We know that a lot of folks are already involved in disaster response, and quite frankly, the faith community is often the first on the ground after a disaster. It might be your creation care team who's working on other activities. And we want you to set goals to assess the risks that you might face in your community, again, using the guide that we've provided here to the left, and then to develop a plan. And once you have that plan, you want to connect with your congregation and with your community about what you've done and how they can take advantage of that work. And certainly communicate and regularly update that plan and then implement it, of course. We have provided a host of different resources for you on this. Things as simple as ready.gov. So again, for those of you who are familiar with disaster response, you may already be familiar with this website. We've included different tools and resources on our own page, blessedtomorrow.org. And then if you want more detail on those regional impacts that you see here on the left, you can visit the National Climate Assessment page. It goes into much greater detail. It might be just of interest to you anyway. Okay, and then finally, the third section of the guide, we dive into advocacy. So now this might be something that you're ready to do today. It might be something that you or your congregation need to work through the other steps to get to. But what do we mean when we talk about advocacy? So we know advocacy matters, whether you're talking about just engaging your own congregation and educating them on what's going on, or whether we're talking about actually going and speaking with policymakers. Faith leaders are trusted messengers. Our research, national research, continues to demonstrate that this is true, that Americans listen to faith leaders and especially policymakers. And of course, policymakers want to hear from constituents, as always, and as people of faith, we are constituents, and so we have a voice, and we have something that we need to be sharing. Something else that our own research has identified is that nearly 3/4 of Americans are concerned about climate change, but only 57% think others are. And so I think this really reiterates the importance of talking about this issue to help others feel comfortable that this is not a political issue. This is something that's real, it's happening, and as people of faith, we're called to act so that we can help care for our neighbors, we can help care for our children, we can ensure that we're providing a world for future generations that looks a lot like what we've had and not something worse. And again, through faithful advocacy, we can certainly promote solutions that better care for creation and specifically advance justice. We talked a lot about how vulnerable communities, often marginalized communities, communities of color, women, Native communities are often the most impacted by climate change. And so there's a spectrum of advocacy and engagement. At a minimum, we can just be becoming more climate literate. You know, what is climate and how does it relate to faith? And then we can start talking about it with confidence. We can talk to our friends, our family, our congregations, and our communities. And then we can certainly take that to the next level, whether it's something like writing an op-ed or visiting your mayor or visiting your federal elected officials. Building these steps just really allows you to have the confidence to speak about this issue. So again, in the guide, we talk specifically about how you can do this just in your own congregation, so mostly building awareness and encouraging folks to act, how you can do this in your community through things like holding community events, film showings, maybe you show the 3-minute film that we just showed here, and then how you can do this with policymakers. We also recommend folks to visit our Let's Talk Faith and Climate guide. You can also find that on elca.org/environment. And it walks through tested messages and framing that we know work to help ensure that people of faith understand that this is a matter of moral responsibility that we're called to. We provide sample sermons, sample talking points, so that you can craft your own authentic message using your own voice and your own experiences. So please check that out as well. And then finally, we dive into a bolder witness. We know not everyone is called to these kinds of activities, but it can be a valid way to express your faith and bear witness to climate change. You may have seen across the country, certainly across the world, especially in Europe right now, there's a lot of marching, protesting, and sometimes, yes, civil disobedience to call attention to this issue and really encourage policymakers to take action. And so if you feel called into that space, there is a section of the guide that talks about this and encourages folks to get involved as they can. And of course, I think the #1 wonderful tool and resource that you have is the ELCA Advocacy Office. Ruth is your point of contact there. And I just really encourage you all to stay connected with them through their action alerts, their in-person activities that they conduct throughout the year, their opportunities for letter writing. There's a lot of ways to get involved with this that they make it very easy to do. But we also have some other information on our other websites, those programs I mentioned at the beginning of the call. We talk about how health leaders are actively advocating on climate solutions. And in the Path to Positive Communities program, we talk about how local leaders are leading on this issue. And it may be helpful information for you to share with your own community leaders. Okay, so next steps, and then we'll dive into some Q&A. So how to move forward. So again, I mentioned, please stay connected with your faith traditions work. The ELCA advocacy team is fantastic, and they're going to keep you up to speed on what you can do specifically with and for the church. Get moving forward. Start thinking about how you can reduce energy use if you haven't already started. And hopefully the guide can be a helpful tool for you to do that. And please share it with others. Become climate literate. Remember, I talked about that Let's Talk Faith and Climate guide. It'll really help you feel more confident in communicating on this issue. If you haven't already, feel free to join our Blessed Tomorrow newsletter. We produce monthly bi-monthly talking points, all kinds of research and tools like the guide itself, and you'll just be able to stay up to speed on what we're offering. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about an upcoming program that we're launching with the ELCA and several of our other partners. It's called the Blessed Tomorrow Climate Ambassador Program. I think we're actually going to be calling it the Envoy Program within the ELCA. But it's an opportunity for you to do this kind of training, but much deeper. So it's a 3-hour course. And afterwards, you actually receive certification and are encouraged to go out into the community and talk to others. And we provide support for you to do that. So stay tuned. It should be coming later this year and early into next year. And we're really looking forward to the partnership with ELCA. And then, of course, as I mentioned, please engage your community. If it's simply just talking to your congregation, if you're not already, or something more sophisticated like writing an op-ed, hosting public events, or considering writing your elected officials, now is the time. We know from science that we have about a decade to act. I know that sounds shocking, but if we don't take action and make some important changes to the way that we're all living and to the policies that are in place, unfortunately, we're going to see the worst effects of climate change. And so now is the time, and we are really called to such a time as this, as Bishop Eaton says often. These are your resources, the ELCA advocacy team, us, Lutherans Restoring Creation. Please connect with them if you're not already. Interfaith Power and Light, 40 chapters across the country. Find out if there's one in your community and see what they have to offer. And again, Creation Justice Ministries produces wonderful liturgical resources, Sunday school resources, etc. So please check out all of these organizations. So with that, I am going to turn it back over to Ruth, and we can open it up for Q&A. So please, again, chat those questions. I know we have several already. Please continue to send them our way, and we'll try to get to as many as we can.
I want to thank you, Annie, for the presentation. And again, I just want to echo what Annie has stated in the presentation. We really can't think of anything that's more important right now than addressing climate change because of the situation we're in. But we do know that there are things that we can do. And as a church, we know that we have the power and the ability to make changes and to move for a just transition. What I'd like to also do is say that you will be hearing a lot more from us on climate matters, climate change matters. You will be hearing, as Annie said, a lot more about the Envoy program. And then also, that will be also connected with now what we have, a Care for Creation coaching program. But what I'd like to do now is to open it up for questions. So if you do have additional questions, I can't see the questions that are there, Annie. I see one, but I'll let you go ahead and answer the questions.
Yeah, so we have a question, and we certainly get this often from someone who may be connected to a rural or a smaller congregation, and says, you know, the video mentioned, and I think I mentioned, that it's important to talk about this issue, and those pastors who talk more about it actually see greater impact with in terms of getting their communities engaged. But is that true for rural churches? You know, some pastors are afraid to talk about this issue. I just really want to encourage, first I want to go back to the statistic that I shared, that we know 75% of Americans, and this is a statistically significant national poll, 75% of Americans are concerned about climate change. And yet, you know, a little over half of Americans are believe that others are as well. And so there's a gap here. There's 25% of those who are concerned who don't think other people are, and who may be afraid to talk about it, who may be afraid to bring it up. We can talk and should talk about this from a place of faith. And that's where the Let's Talk Faith and Climate Guide, I hope, can give you a lot of encouragement. If you are in a similar situation as the questioner, check that guide out. It really talks about how you can connect this to Scripture, how you can connect this to our call to care for creation, and certain language that you can use that just opens the door to conversation. You don't have to get into all of the nitty-gritty details or all of the specific actions that need to be taken. There are ways to open dialogue that make it a safe space and a brave space for us all to step into. And then as you start to get more folks engaged in dialogue, you can go into some more specifics. So again, Let's Talk Faith and Climate. I just encourage you to check that guide out. Someone asked how you can access the webinar. So yes, it is being recorded. We're going to be sharing the file with the ELCA Advocacy Office, and I believe they're going to be loading it onto the website. So it will be shared with everyone who registered, and we'll also be including it on the website. Let's see, other questions that have come in. And again, please chat your questions if you have them. Does the ELCA have additional resources to help us best address this critical issue in our congregations, such as videos, studies? I will share some information and then turn it over to Ruth. So we did do a survey of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America on attitudes and awareness of this issue, and found wonderfully that the vast majority of the church is very concerned and wants to take action. That information has been presented in different formats, and I'll let Ruth share a little more about what else the church is doing, but there might be ways that we can get some of the highlights out to folks who are interested. So Ruth, I'll turn it back to you.
I would also encourage you to go to our EAC Advocacy webpage, where you have resources there, resources that connect some basic on climate change. Also, there'll be resources there like why Lutherans care for creations, what's the responsibility there. And then there will also be additional resources and connections to other sites. We also have a direct link there to the work that's being done by Lutheran Restoring Creations. And you'll be hearing more about what's going on and what we're doing. Just to give an example, I am literally right now sitting in Germany because the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is having their mid-year intersessional meeting now on climate change. And you'll be hearing more about what's coming out here and what's coming up at the end of the year when the larger climate change conference will be held in Santiago, Chile. In addition, you'll be hearing more about an action or event we're hosting on September 20th with the Episcopal Church, the Church of Sweden, and also Texas Impact on making a just transition to increase help. How can faith-based entities help countries increase ambition, that is the commitment to reduce greenhouse emissions in a manner that's just. Annie talked about that we do have to make this transition. We have to make it in a just manner, because those who are most vulnerable and the marginalized have been the ones who are most impacted. And we need to, you'll be hearing more from us on legislative issues, and there'll just be a lot we'll be bringing forward to you in the near and long-term future.
Thanks, Ruth. I have another question for you. Someone asked, what can synods do to help congregations and rostered leaders to lead on this issue? And are there any who are currently doing this well?
I would say yes. There are congregations who are doing it well. Lutheran Restored Creation is doing a lot of work in this area, and what they can do is you can go to our website. There are materials there that you can do. You can contact me or contact any one of us in the ELCA advocacy office, and we can help you provide resources. And we do understand that there's a difference in talking about climate issues if you're in rural America as opposed to being in suburbia or inner city. But I would encourage you to give us to talk to us, contact us, and we can point you in a direction. Because each question may be different, but I say first start with our website and/or contact me directly.
And Ruth, you mentioned earlier, but just to reiterate the coaching program and the benefits of that there's a new curriculum specifically on care creation with the coaching program. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Again, you can contact me, but it's coming through ELCA's Stewardship group. ELCA has had a coaching program for a very long time, but this year we are including in that program the Care for Creation. And so what we're doing with that is that at the end of right now that has already started, but we will also be linking that with the Onboard program that will be coming from Blessed Tomorrow. But in the Care Creation program, we're working to help people become coaches in helping their congregations to become more attuned to caring for creations. The coaches will not be the people who will necessarily be doing it, but they will be there to help or accompany the congregations in caring for creations. And we're hoping to get as many coaches trained as possible. Again, you can contact me and I can put you in contact with our stewardship people, specifically Keith Monday, or I can give you direct access to Keith and/or to Lutheran Restoring Creation.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Karen Kruger with the Advocacy Office wants me to remind all of you that you can find a lot of resources, again, at elca.org/environment on your screen, and that there are also some other resources available. If you go to elca.org/resources, under Advocacy, there's an Environment tab that has a host of other resources as well. So just wanted to share that. Something else that someone perhaps from the Minneapolis area synod mentioned is that they actually have an environmental organizer on staff in that synod, which sounds fantastic. So thank you for sharing that.
Go ahead. I think Emily, so I think I've talked to her, yes.
Great. And Ruth, again, this is a question for you. I know you're doing a lot of great work around this issue. So we had someone ask or suggest converting to clean energy will, at least in the short run, displace some workers. Yes, many of whom will be economically challenged by such displacement. What efforts are we as the church undertaking, especially in rural America, to provide retraining, reemployment opportunities for displaced fossil fuel workers? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mentioned just transition a few minutes ago, that the transition has to be just. And what we're finding, just transition is a term or a phrase that's sort of a catchy phrase right now, but what that really means is that we need to make a transition across all sectors, not just energy, all sectors to a carbon neutral society. And what that really means is that we need to get to the point where the carbon emissions, whether it's from CO2 or methane, ends up being zero. So what we're doing is that we're looking at different, and this is what we started this year, and making that just transition is key priority for us this year. And in addition to that, we have to make that transition where we leave no one behind. So what we're doing is starting first, because it is a complicated, it will take quite a while to do it, but we're starting first with identifying some regions around the country, and we're working literally with, you are starting to talk and work with utility companies through the Edison Electric Institute, where we will identify some pilot areas which are starting to make that transition, because we know that when you make that transition from coal burning to a transitional natural gas to renewable energy, that it's not just the workers of that industry that are impacted, but it's also those communities, that mom and pop restaurant that depended on those people working in those industries for the lunch crowd and those kind of things, the hospital. So what we're doing is identifying with some other faith members areas that we can look into to try to identify how do we actually conduct a just transition. Now, with that said, if there's an area that is currently undergoing that, please contact me and we can move that up to the front of the list. We have not exactly put this in place yet, but we are looking to encourage congregations or churches to become really good centers for helping to train. We're identifying partners outside that may be willing to work with us, because as faith communities, we need to go into the community and not do top down, but we need to work with the grassroots community and understand what their issues and needs are and help them and walk with them in developing the needs or the measures in place so that they will have continue to have a vibrant community. Now, that is a long answer, but what you need to know is that what will work in Minneapolis will not be the same thing that will work in Alabama or Mississippi. Each area is different, so we need to go into each area and identify the needs of those areas, and again, to walk with the people, not be top down. But if there's an area of specific concern, please contact me at ruth.ivory-moore@elca.org, and we definitely be wanting to work with you.
Great, thanks, Ruth. Just one other question, and then if others have any remaining questions, we might be able to take one more. Someone asks, what are the resources for grants to install renewable energy? Just to share that often looks different in different communities. Some communities and some states provide different types of grants or other incentives. And we have, again, I mentioned the partnership that we have with Interfaith Power and Light. They have, again, 40 chapters around the country and are often very in tune with what might be available in your community. Another great resource is the EPA Energy Star program. They actually have a gentleman who works specifically with congregations on energy use reduction and moving to different sources. And they are often very well aware of different resources that are available and actually can work directly with individual congregations to navigate that. Ruth, is there anything else that you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have a very good relationship with the Energy Star program that you're mentioning with EPA, and the coordinator is Jerry Lawson, and he's very anxious to come out and work with you. Matter of fact, in the Pennsylvania area, now I guess maybe it was 6-7 months ago, they actually did some work with our people in the Pennsylvania area, with our state public policy office people in Pennsylvania. In addition to that, we're working with EPA. We are identifying projects with EPA related to things like water and other environmental projects beyond climate change, like lead and things like that. So if there's an area of the country that has an issue they want to work, the EPA's Office of Public Engagement is really interested in working with us. Also, this is not fully developed yet, but as part of doing some of the just transition work, we have also been in contact with some funders that we're trying to see how we can work with them. And one of them is actually called the Just Transition Fund. So as part of this work, we're working with the utilities, we are looking to do that. And like Annie said, the EPA does have some grants in some areas, but they are competitive. So I ask you to contact me, and then we can help put together proposals to work with the EPA. Literally, I was talking to EPA about 2 weeks ago about measures like that. So there are no promises, but contact me and we'll see what we can work out there. And there's another thing too. There were power grants that were out there under the previous administration, and some of that still may be there. But we're working. It's not quite as fluent as it was before, but we're still working there. And particularly in the Appalachian regions, we're still doing a lot of advocacy to try to get some funding released under a bill that has not been passed yet, but funding is out there for coal communities. And we're trying to work through Congress to get that bill passed to release some of that money to rebuild economically some of the coal communities. So I would just encourage you, whatever questions you have regarding that, please contact me and we can work through it.
Great. Thanks, Ruth. Well, we don't see any other questions at this time. So I'll guess, Ruth, I'll turn it back to you to close us, and maybe we can give everyone the gift of a minute.
Okay. Thank you again, everyone, for being on the call. We thank you for, we want to also thank Annie from Blessed Tomorrow for giving us an excellent presentation and for working with us. It's the partnership or the collaborative relationship that we have with Blessed Tomorrow has really been very productive in the resources that we have available to us. So we invite you to check out our website. You see the website on the screen now, elca.org/environment, and you'll find a lot of resources there. And please if you have any questions, please contact me. You see my email address on the screen. And again, thank you for joining us. And very shortly, we will have this presentation recorded, and I will be able to get the link out to you so you may be able to use the slides, or if you need to have other slides, just let me know. Again, thank you.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And this will conclude the webinar for today. Have a great afternoon.